Steve.
It's great to be here, Rain. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I
Couple of
appreciate you being back.
couple of Durham boys. We're ready to go for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I appreciate you being here. I said it on a post this weekend or last week. You were actually the first two timer that I've had on the show. So
Wow.
very monumentous
Hey.
occasion here. And also, I got an alert just yesterday that the Storytelling Lab had its first episode on yesterday, 5 years ago. So
Wow.
another monumentous.
Congratulations.
Yeah, appreciate it. I'm
Congratulations.
excited about it. We've been doing this for a while, and
Yeah.
I'm always excited to talk to storytellers and writers and marketers and filmmakers. And so yeah, we're gonna have a good
All
chat
right.
today. So in that vein, the first thing I want to ask you, I'm really excited to talk about the book. I told you before we started that I got my bundle and I appreciate that. And I even
Uh-huh.
made a video unboxing it and showing everybody what was
Wow.
inside.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, hopefully that helps. But your work has inspired a lot of people, many of whom have inspired me themselves, the Brian Koppelmans and the Tim Ferrisses of the world. And oh, by the way, screenwriter Paul Guillot was on the show not too long ago. You've inspired him as well, and he wanted to send his love. And you've kind of, in a way, united creators and artists based on this, your insights, your perspective, your philosophy on sitting down and doing the work. My question is, how do you view yourself in that? Is it, you can answer, it sounds like you might already have something in the chamber.
You mean as far as that influence that
Well, I mean, like, so you influence and inspire a lot of people with what you're doing, which is what you've done. You've been doing it a long time, but I know that sometimes our identity doesn't really change. As you say, I'll put it this way, Steve: resistance doesn't get any easier, right? You still with it, deal with it daily. So the
yeah.
question is, do you consider yourself the forever student, still learning lessons, valuable
Oh
lessons every
yeah, for
day,
sure.
or do you consider yourself a mentor of sorts, looking at people lower down the mountain, for lack of a better expression, and trying to give them, some guidance along the
Hmm.
path?
Well, I never sort of set out to be or thought of myself or even still think of myself as a mentor. But apparently I am because, certain books that I've written, people respond to. But I'm very much still in the trenches as a writer, struggling, every day. It never gets any easier to do what I'm doing, just like it is for everybody else. So I just see myself as a soldier in the trenches along with everybody else. I'm glad that whatever insights, excuse me, I may have had are helpful to people. But
Yeah.
I'm really sort of, when I'm like in the War of Art, I'm really writing to myself. I'm really just sort of writing to understand what I think. How when you have to spell it out and put it on paper, it makes you clarify your thinking. But so anyway, I consider myself a soldier in the trenches.
I think that's important for people to hear, because it's not to show them that it never gets any easier necessarily, although maybe that's a good thing. But for them to understand that for those they might look up to, it's no different. I think that's a really big thing. Sometimes we tend to, I've been here myself, look at someone you aspire to be like, or you look up to, or you admire, as perhaps having some secret that you don't have, or they're, some
Yeah.
superpower you don't have access to. And I think it's really important to ground people and say, like, no, like, it's going to be the same if you start today as it will be 40 years from now. And in a way, that's a good thing. I mean, that's a good thing. The playing field is level, at least from their perspective, when they can view it that way. So I think it's
Yeah.
important that you say that.
I mean, I read an interview with Philip Roth a few years ago, and they were asking him after how many 30 novels or something, did it get any easier? And he said no. He said because each story presents its own set of problems, and you've never solved those problems before. I don't care who you are or what stories you've done, right? I'm sure Shakespeare at the 40th play still was having to figure out, how do I get the lovers apart and then bring them back together? How do I, each story or whatever is a new puzzle that has to be solved, and you can't really fall back, in my experience anyway, on the way you solved it the last time.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned The War of Art, which is one of those books that I was alluding to earlier, that kind of unites artists and creators alike. What what made you write that? What was the decision behind that? I mean, you had at some point you had an epiphany, whether large or small, that said like, I'm going to do this, which is significantly different than what you had been doing at that point.
Well, what happened was, um, when you're a working writer, friends will come to you and say, "I've got a book in me. Can you help me? You know, can you sit down and talk with me and get me started?" So I would sit down with friends and sometimes stay up till 2 in the morning with them. And the first thing I would do is I would warn them about, what I call resistance with a capital R. And basically, I would say the writing is easy. It's the sitting down every day to do it that's hard. And I would kind of try to psych them up, for hours. And of course, in the end, nobody ever listened to me and nobody ever actually did it. So finally, after, I don't know, 6 or 7 of these things, I just said, let me just write this stuff down. And it's like a short little book. And then when somebody wants to ask me the same question, I'll just say, here, read this. So I wrote The War of Art in like 2 months, just kind of came out really fast because the ideas were really clear to me because I'd, said them verbally to people so many times. So that was kind of how it happened. I never thought that it would have the success that it did or have the impact that it did. And a part of me at the time thought, I'm the only guy that's experiencing this. Everybody else is having an easy time. I'm just crazy and I have this demon in me that I have to overcome. But to my amazement, you know, not only writers, but photographers, actors, dancers, comedians would say, "Oh, yeah, I'm struggling like mad with this." So that was interesting to me. I never expected that.
Yeah, that takes us right back to what I was saying earlier about sometimes when we're at that stage, we think we're the only ones dealing with it. That's
Yeah,
why it's
yeah,
so important for me and hopefully for the people listening to hear you say, not that I want you to go through the struggle, but that it is still a struggle. Like it's still challenging and you have to
yeah,
develop a system to sit your butt down and do it. I think
yeah.
that's really important for people to hear. So let's fast forward then. This is also and starting with government cheese, you've kind of branched off, we'll say, in another direction. But this is definitely different than anything you've done with the Daily Pressfield. So, what was the decision behind starting this project?
First of all, let me just say that the government cheese, as you're mentioning, is a memoir
Mhm.
that I wrote it came out about a year ago, I think. And it's just sort of me putting down the real things that happened to me, a lot of them in Durham, North Carolina, along the way for this thing. But then the Daily Pressfield is an idea that Ryan Holiday gave me because of his book, The Daily Stoic. And we were talking, and he said to me, you've got so much content across so many sort of, fiction, nonfiction, self-help, whatever. This is exactly the kind of book that you should put together. So what I did think, Rain, was that, like, again, people sort of come to me and say, I've got a book in me. How do I write it? And I
Mhm.
realized that my stuff is sort of spread over many, many books. You know, The War of Art, Do the Work, The Artist's Journey, blah, blah, blah. But there isn't any kind of place where it's all sort of pulled together in a form that somebody could use if they were starting on page one, or a screenplay or a record album or any kind of a long form project where I could sort of take them in a 365-day format from A to Z, and hitting all of the beats along the way, like second act horrors and things like that, that that I know everybody's going to experience because everybody does experience. So that was kind of the idea, to do a kind of year-long book that you could pick up on day one of a project you were starting and use it as kind of a guide all the way through.
Speaking of Ryan Holiday, I'm a big fan of his work as well. And it seems like you have a great community of friends, peers, colleagues of different backgrounds, different ages. How important is that, those connections, those communities to the creative journey, the creative process, or even the personal journey for people?
Um, it's funny, in a way, they're very important because it's great to have peers and friends and people that are mentors to you. But on the other hand, it's also you're in this alone, and the room when you close the door and sit down, nobody can really help you. So it's kind of a yes and no thing. Uh, in the end, the writing is a solitary activity, except for the goddess, of course, that's helping you do that. But pretty much you're in that room alone.
I mentioned I've been having these conversations a lot lately, but I mentioned screenwriter Paul Gio in the beginning of the conversation, and
Yeah.
talked a lot about voice. And he had a book that came out recently too that talked a lot about voice. How important is finding your voice in terms of being a writer, but I think it also applies to being an artist in general. You mentioned photographers, et cetera, et cetera. But how important was that quest for you to determine what a Steven Pressfield book would or should sound like?
That's a great question, Rain. And it's what's weird, of course, is particularly in fiction, the voice changes with each book because in one you might be speaking in the first person as a small girl, and in the next one, you might be speaking as somebody that has died and is reciting a story from beyond the grave, right? So the voice kind of changes from story to story. Only in a book like The War of Art or something like that, for me, am I kind of speaking in my own voice.
Mhm.
But even that is kind of an artificial voice, It's a voice that is dictated by the material. Like for The War of Art, it seems like it's me, but it's not really me talking. I sort of had to have a voice that was kind of hardcore, almost like a Marine Corps drill instructor,
Mm,
or a voice that was going to kick the reader's ass a little bit, and have no mercy.
yeah.
And but that kind of evolved out of the material itself. But beyond that, Rain, I know I'm kind of blathering on
No,
here,
no, no.
but there was a point for me um, around the time I first had a book published, The Legend of Bagger Vance, which was like 1995, I think, where I did sort of find my quote unquote voice, even though, like I just was saying to you, it changes from book to book, and it's never really me. But and I don't really have the answer for this. It did become at that time, if you'll forgive this word, authentic,
Yeah.
whereas it really wasn't before. And even though it's different in each book, and it's not really me, it's authentic to the story, to the demands of the story.
Would you call it, would another term for that be like style? Because I do think that the writing, your style is similar through the other books, even though the voice may be different. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think they're definitely connected, voice and style. Like
Yeah.
for instance, in Gates of Fire, which was my book about the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, I decided to write it in a very archaic style because, in other words, kind of like what a Cambridge or Oxford Don, the style they would use in like 1890.
Hmm.
And the reason I wanted to do that was I wanted the book to feel like it had been written at that time, at 2,500, years ago. And so I deliberately adopted this kind of really old-fashioned formal style. And I could have picked, or anybody could have picked any number of styles, but that was a deliberate choice to evoke the time that the story was about. And I've done that in other books too, changing the style to suit the time period.
Yeah. And most of your fiction has been in like historical fiction.
Yeah, it's
Was
been
that,
said in the ancient world. Yeah,
yeah, a conscious choice that you made, or was it just like, oh, I really love writing this stuff because you were passionate about it?
that's another great question. It just as you know, Rain, I'm a believer in the muse and the goddess that she gives you kind of the next assignment, and then it's your job to do it. And uh, it was as much a surprise to me to find that I was writing in the ancient world and that I was really comfortable there
Mhm.
as it was to anybody. It was more of a surprise to me. I never would have guessed that, even 1 month before. Um, Again, I really believe that every book or piece of work that you come up with should surprise you. And
Mm,
if it doesn't surprise you, there's something wrong.
I like that. One of the things that's so evident and apparent in Gates of Fire and anything else that you write in the fiction world is the depth of knowledge with the little nuances of that world, whatever it might be, like the type of armor that they have on and the hierarchy of the Spartan system, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's super, super dense. I have to imagine there's an incredible amount of research that goes into that for you. Or is that something where it's like you already studied that part of history and you kind of have a good foundation to start from? But that tell me about that process because it's a lot. And thinking about it from the constructor of it, the writer of it, like it seems daunting, to be honest.
Uh,
As thorough as
those
you are.
books do, obviously, they do require a shitload of research.
Right.
And, like I used to do my research at the UCLA library. I live in Los Angeles. And like I remember a couple of books I wrote were about Alexander the Great. And if you go into the stacks at the UCLA library, there's a space about that wide of nothing but books about Alexander. So I just read them all, and took notes and took in the whole thing. But then, to true confessions here, to full disclosure here, I also am a real believer that it's okay to make shit up, you know, when you don't know, you know,
Yeah.
when but you have to be, I think, uh, responsible to the era. I'll give you an example here.
Yeah, please.
I remember I was watching was something about the Vietnam War, and it was about helicopter pilots, and they took you sort of inside the cockpit, and the pilots had sort of, without exception, on their dashboards or instrument panels, they had all kinds of little trinkets, like their 4-year-old daughter had made a little bit of a lucky charm for them. And they hung that, on the instrument panel. They had like 4 or 5 little lucky charms. So I thought to myself, what on the inside of a shield that a Spartan or a warrior of those days would have, big concave bowl shield that protected their life. I'm sure they would have little trinkets that their kids made for them, their wife or their mom. So I've never read that anywhere. It's not in the history anywhere, but I kind of put that in there in the story. And I think that's a kind of a detail that it's legitimate to do that.
Yeah.
And I do think it evokes reality. I think a big part of it is of writing something historical is imagining yourself back into the time and kind of asking yourself, what would this really be like? What would they really talk about? How would they really talk? That kind of thing. And then you take your best shot that's what it is. And so it's half research and half invention.
Well, here's a like chicken and egg question. Uh, when you're working on a new story that's a period piece like that, do you front load the research and have the details ready and then write the story, or do you just try to churn through the character arc and that sort of stuff and then go back in and add details through research?
That's another great question. Um, I have a friend, Randy Wallace, who wrote Braveheart.
Mhm.
And you would think, watching Braveheart, wow, that is really steeped in details. I mean, it's so realistic. And I asked Randy, I said, how much research do you do? And he said, as little as possible. And he said, what I really do is I want to get the story first. The story I want to tell. How does it start? What's the middle? What's the end? Of course, you know something about the story. William Wallace, XYZ happened to him. But I think I go along with that too. It's the most important question is, what is this story about? How does it start? What's the middle? How does it end? Who's the hero? Who's the villain? What's it about? And I think once you have the story, then you can go back and fill in the details. Like I'm just working on a story now that's set in the Middle Ages in Spain. And I don't know a damn thing about Spain, but I just went there on a trip. I took a trip with Diana, and we were there for a month, kind of driving around. And the thing is mostly written already, but I wanted to see if the countryside was what I thought it was like and what it felt like to look to be in a castle and look out over the valley. And I found in the end, I didn't change very much when I got home. I sort of, even though things were not quite as realistic as I thought, screw it, I'll just stay with what I got.
Yeah, I'm glad you took it there. I was going to ask about that because I remember seeing you post about that trip. Which I mean, I think is important, even if you just go and just, I mean, this might sound kind of cheesy, but just feel the vibe. Like, I
Yeah,
mean, just being
exactly.
in that space. Listen,
Yeah,
a lot of what I'm kind of poking at in the beginning of this conversation is, I'm working on a lot of projects that are, no surprise to you, Eastern North Carolina based. Some period pieces and some not. And that's a place you've written about it yourself where you have to kind of be there at least for some short, or extended
yeah,
period of time to understand the culture, the smells, the sights, just
yeah,
yeah, the environment as a whole. And so even if you don't come away with tangible, little bits of information, that's a lot of it. I think that kind of
yeah,
underneath, the
yeah.
surface.
But also, I think it is important to come away with the tangible stuff, Like
Certainly.
if you're in New Orleans, you realize that a lot of the parking lots are paved with seashells.
Hmm.
That you would, if you hadn't been there, you would never know that, right? But that's like a detail that I think you have to sort of, you know, really write down, make a note of it, make sure that
Yes,
you got that, and then put it in there. Even if it's only 4 words in a
totally.
sentence, it's so evocative.
Well,
And
those are the bits that you can really play with that really make the piece stand out because in Eastern North Carolina we use oyster shells as well in driveways, and so where my mind went, is like if I were to write that sentence, that 4 word sentence or whatever, I would probably I recognize the sound of those popping when the
yeah,
tires
yeah,
roll over,
yeah,
and that's enough. Just that one little sentence to just paint to fill out painting the picture or setting the scene to someone just a little bit. It's such a good point, and you can use that as such leverage in just a little sentence like that gives
yeah.
it that voice and that style that we've been talking about. That's
Yeah, it
it's
works. It
important.
works so well. Just like you say, just a little bit. I'm just thinking about Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, where a lot of the earlier scenes there take place in cafes in Paris, right?
Yep.
And he'll
Yep.
talk about paying for the saucers, which is like if you're in France, right? That's how they charge you, right? You don't actually get a bill; you get a saucer that has 2 francs or 3 francs or whatever. And he just throws that away in one line, but it's so evocative. You go, ah, he was really there. He really knows his shit. This is what it's really like.
It's funny. I've never really, I mean, it makes sense, but I've never thought about it this way. But this is all like it's a recipe, right? And what we're talking about right now is like that one ingredient that you give just a little
Yeah, yeah,
dash
yeah,
of, right? But
yeah,
then now, if I start to take that metaphor, that analogy, and expand it, it's like it's all recipe building, which takes time to cultivate that skill and what your style might be. I mean, I learned a lot from my brother and my mother, but my style is a little bit different. It's not as sweet as my mom's. I might not put sugar all in the spaghetti sauce, but yeah, this is like that secret ingredient. Just a little dash, a little dab will do you, as they say.
yeah.
You mentioned the muse earlier. You alluded to it, and I do know that that's a big part of your approach and perspective. I can bring it up actually on the screen. I haven't read Rick Rubin's new book. I don't know if you
Uh,
have.
yeah, definitely.
Um,
The
okay,
creative act. Yeah.
yes, but I've heard enough about it and saw one piece in particular that I wanted to bring up. This kind of relates to the muse. I want to see what your thoughts on this. And it was basically, he said something. Yeah, here it goes. If you have an idea you're excited about and don't bring it to life, it's not uncommon for the idea to find its voice through another maker. This ain't because the other artist stole your idea. It's because the idea's time has come. And I just thought that was so interesting to think that, like, an idea exists out there, right? And it's up to you to either seize it, and grab that opportunity or not, but it's going to go find a life of its own. I just want to ask you straightforwardly, like, what do you think about that concept?
Um, on the one hand, I agree with that completely. Like um Roseanne Cash says that an artist has to travel with a catcher's mitt because you got to catch the ideas. Otherwise, in her case, she says, or it's going to wind up with Lucinda Williams. Um, and I've heard other stories. There's that famous story of Elizabeth Gilbert. Have you heard that one with I forgot the other writer's name. It's another wonderful female writer, But the story was that Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love and Big
Hmm.
Magic, right? That she started on some kind of an idea and she got like into it for a few months and she sort of put it aside, you know. And a year and a half went by and she met this other writer, this other female writer, and they spent a few days together and really got to know each other. And as they were parting, they kissed on the lips. And sure enough, like, I don't know, a few months later, this other writer, I wish I could remember her name because she's like a famous, really good writer, the idea came to her to do this book that Elizabeth Gilbert had put aside. And she did write it, and it did win the Pulitzer Prize. And Elizabeth Gilbert is telling this story about how, did the kiss have something to do with that? Did the, who, I don't know. But it's a great story. And
Absolutely.
on the other hand, I'll take the other side, Rain, which is I really believe that when the goddess gives out ideas, she gives it to you alone.
Mm,
This is my feeling. And I can't believe that a Bruce Springsteen song, if he doesn't write it, somebody else is going to write it. I mean,
fair point.
those are his songs, or a Joni Mitchell song, or anybody else, Taylor Swift or whoever. Um, so I don't know. It could go both ways,
I
but
mean,
those ideas are out there floating around.
yeah, I think like most things, the truth is there somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
But yeah, I see both sides of that as well. Um, I saw Barbie this summer. I don't know if you got a
I did.
chance
I
to
have
see
not
it.
seen it yet.
Okay, so Greta Gerwig, who's an amazing director, it was just chock full of homages of references to previous great movies. Not even like subtly, like very on the
Uh huh.
nose. And it started off with the opening scene from 2001 Space Odyssey with the monolith and all that, but it was
Uh huh.
Barbie, destroying all the other dolls before her type of thing. I was laughing out loud.
Uh
No one
huh.
else in the theater got it. But it was a lot of that, and it was very clear her influences, and she talks about it a lot. So the question is, because I know you do this too, in reading Government Cheese, there was a portion of your journey where you basically studied. You watched, I forget who your mentor was during this chapter, but you were watching all the great movies, all the old film noir, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, how important is it to any artist to know the greats and the great work that has come before them?
Tremendously important. It couldn't be more important. I think. I think one of the things that I sort of have issue with a lot of the young people that are out there doing their stuff is writers and filmmakers is they don't have that.
Yeah,
Their knowledge goes back about 4 years to The Sopranos. They don't even know what The Sopranos is.
that's true.
And they certainly don't know what the movie Alien or Blade Runner, or if you want to go farther back, they don't know Double Indemnity, they don't know Casablanca, and when you get into books, they don't know anything. And if you want to go farther back into history, the Roman Empire, or the ancient Greeks, or the Chinese, or something. They don't know anything about that. I think you really, anybody that wants to do anything, like if you were, who Jim Mattis is, who was Secretary of Defense under
Oh, sure.
Trump,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
four-star Marine
yeah.
general, all-time great fighting general. I mean, he's a believer. His library just covers wall after wall of that. If you want to be, let's say, a young officer in the military, you got to read Rommel, you've got to read Vegetius, you got to read Caesar, Thucydides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You got to read everybody because you're going to be in a in a shitstorm somewhere and not know what to do. Whereas if you could flash back and say, well, Rommel was in this same situation in 1919 in Italy, whatever it is. So I do think it's the canon, CANON, that you got to know. The
And when
There was a great story about Scott Fitzgerald and Sheila Graham, who wrote the book Beloved Infidel. Right, she was his lover at one point, and he and she was not educated, so he gave her a list, of however many hundred books. You must read this thing. There's another great story. I'm blathering on, I know, Ray, but
no, no,
this was also Roseanne Cash. she was traveling in a on a tour bus, on a musical with her dad, and they were just sitting around playing a few songs. And he said, "Well, let's play such and such." And she said, "Oh, I don't know that one." And he said, "Okay, let's play this one." And she said, "I don't know that one either." And his face went white, and he sat down, he wrote her a list that she read. She later made an album called The List, and it was his list of 100 great songs, kind of what you would call Americana songs, right? Country
Mhm.
songs, or you know, and that if you're going to be a singer, you have to know these songs. And so how great is that to have Johnny Cash give you the list of the 100 greatest
Yeah,
songs,
pretty
and
amazing.
he's your dad?
If you notice that in top tier musicians of any genre, like they all know all genres and all
Yeah,
the greats, even though they might be, in hip hop or in country. Like if they are one of the best of the best, they always know they're music nerds. That they fall in
yeah.
love with the art and they study
And
it
they
so
love
much.
it. It's not a chore to them, to
No,
learn a certain riff that, Keith Richards did. It's
right?
like great fun to try to, match that exactly.
And once you start going back in time and looking at all of those previous greats or previous periods, you see how cyclical, life and art really is and just how things repeat themselves. You could especially see that in movies. When you were talking about going back in time, we the last conversation we had, we talked a little bit about boxing because I have a small background in that, but it also reminds me of, this is a little bit of a tangent, but of Mike Tyson, who his trainer Customato had all these old reel to reel fights that Mike would watch of the greats up in the attic. And not only that, he would go back and read the Alexander the Great books and study warriors all through history. He's a complete nerd, and a lot of people don't know that because he's got this persona, but
Yeah, yeah,
he's a war nerd. I mean, he's studied all the great warriors through time, and then all the great boxers that came decades before him. And in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why he was the fastest ever to become the heavyweight champion. I
yeah.
mean, he not only was he a great fighter, but he was a student of the game, of the art. You
Yeah, it's
know,
it's funny that he doesn't usually talk about that too much. You don't think about that.
yeah.
It's almost like it's a secret that he's hiding
He,
from people.
he would hide in the attic and for just all night long, just watch all these old tapes. And none of his peers were doing that, right?
Yeah,
I mean, not only were they not training as hard, but that's a part of the training, right? They're not just running and punching bags. Like he's
yeah,
studying and you catch one move and you're like, oh, I'm gonna try that
yeah,
out next time I'm in the
yeah,
ring. So, um, I think going back to people, I don't want to say these days, but people that are just beginning, which is really what I see this book as helping, is someone who is trying to become the thing that their heart desires, right? And a lot of your nonfiction work is targeting that person, so to speak. One of the things that I think gets misunderstood, misconstrued, I forget who said it like this on some podcast I heard, but oftentimes people focus on trying to write a hit or make a hit instead of establishing what this person called a catalog. And last time we talked about your production pace, if you will, of just like as soon as you're done with one, you're out with another because this you don't sit around and rest on your laurels. This one may not get any attention and you don't want that to be to linger too much, so you're pumping it out. And so when I look at your catalog, I mean, that's what's so impressive, not just the War of Art, but that's a 10 plus year catalog that you've built. So the question is, which is more important? What should people be focused on? Because I think that younger people in their journey get a little too focused on this next one. This book has to be the one, or in my world, this film has to be the one that breaks me out.
yeah. I mean, I certainly thought that way for years and years. And it's natural, right? The first one, you figure, I'll never have another. This is the only shot I'll ever have. Let me get.
Yeah,
This has got to be
real.
a do or die. But I think it is sort of interesting to think of your work as like a full career.
Hmm.
Like if you think of if it's books, thinking of an entire shelf of books, 20 books, 30 books. Because if you keep working, you'll have that, or record albums or films or whatever. And I do think it sort of takes a little bit of the pressure off if you say, uh, this is not the only one. It's not do or die. I'm going to do another one and another one and another one. I remember there was a famous story about Cole Porter, who probably our listeners don't know who Cole Porter is, but he was a great songwriter from the 30s and the 40s. And he worked in, like if you pick any standard hit, it was pretty much a Cole Porter hit. And there was something where he did a lot of songs for movies. And at one point he wrote some particular song and it was rejected by the studio, right? And somebody said to him, how do you feel about this, Cole? I mean, your song just got rejected. And he said, I got a million of them. There's another trolley coming down the track. He said, it didn't phase him at all. And I think that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah,
And you were just saying, Rain, about how I seem to have finished one book and move right on to the next one.
yeah.
And that's very deliberate. And I want to say this for any young writer or musician or whatever that's listening. The thing that I'm most terrified of is what Seth Godin calls the dip. It's that if you finish a project and you sort of release it or publish it and you're sitting around waiting for the response, that is death. You can never do that. You've got to have the next one going right away so that as soon as you finish one, you're on to the next one, so that when the first one fails, because they always fail, right? They never live up to your expectations. It doesn't drive you insane because you're already enthused about the next one. And I do think to think in terms of a body of work of an entire career is a great way to think of it.
How important is it for someone at that early stage in their career, their journey to identify as the thing that they want to be? Often I see people like, I want to be a writer, or I'm an aspiring writer.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so how important is it for them to quickly understand or identify, like, no, I am the thing, I'm just at the beginning stage.
It's it is important, but it's really hard to do, Rain. It's
True.
as you know. I mean, for years I could never. If anyone asked me, "Are you a writer?" I would blush and I just couldn't say it because I'm such a loser. I haven't gotten anything published. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. But at least for me, at one point, after like 30 years of doing this freaking thing, I finally could say, in all honesty, I am a writer. I've sold it. Maybe I've only sold one or two things, but God damn it, I've been doing this now for 30 years. So I'm going to give myself a break. It's hard to fake it, when you're not it yet.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to say, I am a writer. I'm not an aspiring writer. I'm a writer. Or I'm a musician or whatever it is. If your heart is in it, then you're it. By the way, let me compliment you right now, just to break in. The questions you're asking are really terrific, and I take my hat off to you for taking this as seriously as you do. And you're doing a great job, and you got a great voice. I just realized, right?
Oh, thank you.
This
Thank
is
you. I
for
appreciate that.
audio. This would be great.
Yeah, it's going out on audio too. Listen, I appreciate that. I don't know if you're just blowing smoke up my
I never
ass,
blow
but
smoke. I wouldn't. I wouldn't do it. What's in it for me? But it's
no,
really true. I want to compliment you.
thank you, brother. I appreciate that. I'll take all the compliments you got. I am very, I have an ego too.
Hmm.
So, my love language is words of affirmation. So that helps. No, I appreciate that sincerely. I mean, you know how I feel about you, pal. I mean, I
Yeah.
love your work. You're very inspiring to me. I appreciate you being back on the show, and it's important to me. But also, this is not a shot at you, but it's equally as important for the people listening to my show. Who I like to help is the people that I am every day and who I was 5 years ago. And it's people that are constantly struggling with this thing you call resistance. And so I just treat myself as a conduit. I mean, and so yeah, I appreciate that, and I hope that they gain a lot of value from it. And I know I gain value from you, so it's important for me to deliver that to them. And if I showed up half-ass, that's not doing it. I got somebody that's tuning in right now that just said Rain's killing it. So that's two compliments with one
Take
stone.
it and run.
Let's go into the book a little bit. Although all of this is kind of about what the point of the book is. But the thing we talked about this a little bit last time, The very first page, or the first chapter, if you will, is resistance wakes up with me. And I asked you a question last time that was something along the lines of like, why are we so tough on ourselves? Why are we so brutal to ourselves with the voices in our head? And I love your perspective on that. And you said, I don't really think it's the voice in our head. I think resistance is this thing that exists. It's an objective force, and we're not doing it to ourselves. It's there. And I can't tell you how liberating that is in a
It is
way,
liberating, isn't
right?
it?
Because it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it's not my fault. I thought I've been holding me back the whole time. Well, I can beat that thing, but to beat the guy in the mirror is, I mean, that's really tough, right? Maybe impossible. So talk to me about that concept of the very first page. It's the first page for a reason. Of resistance wakes up with you.
Yeah, that's day one of the Daily Pressfield. And the reason I wanted it to be day one is because it's like the most fundamental aspect of any creative person is the fact that like people ask me, when in your day do you first experience resistance? And my answer is the minute I open my eyes. And and I'm sure that is true for everybody, for Beethoven, Shakespeare, where they open their eyes and that demon is there right in their face. So the reason I wanted that to be day one is because that's what we all, as creative people or artists, we have to accept that as reality, right? The minute you open your eyes, you're going to be hit, right in the teeth, and you got to be ready for it. That's reality. But to what you were saying, Rain, the way resistance fucks with our minds is it appears as a voice in our head and we mistake it for our own thoughts. When we hear that voice saying, you're no good, you're not good enough to do this thing, you think it's been done a million times, who are you to think you're going to do it? When we hear that voice, we think, oh, that's me
Mm.
objectively assessing the situation. And like you say, if that's the man in the mirror, that's a hell of a problem. But if we realize that resistance is this objective force, a force of nature, just like gravity, just like the turning of the earth, just like the seasons, and that Shakespeare, when he woke up in the morning, the first voice he heard was, who are you to write this thing called Hamlet? This is way beyond you. You are a bum. You're a failed actor. Forget it. Go back to Stratford-on-Avon and hang it up. In other words, that force is there. And if we can recognize it, as you say, as resistance, capital R resistance, then it's a lot easier to dismiss it and just say, oh, that's bullshit. That's just resistance, and let me sit down and get to work. I dismiss it. I sit down, I go to work.
It's kind of a part two of the revelation that I've just had. It's so, man, it's almost like a horror movie you're describing where this thing disguises itself as you or the
Yeah,
voice in your head
it
that's so
is.
creepy and insidious and sheesh.
And the other thing is that it's so diabolical and so nuanced that it really is an intelligent force. It's like a living thing. Like they say, a complex in psychology kind of has its own life within you, whatever it is. This thing will, if it's simpler measures like you're a bum, don't work, it'll move on to the next more nuanced, thought to throw at you to try to knock you off your track. It's a shape shifting son of a gun.
Totally. Uh, I think it was Predator. Reminds me of a line in Predator. If it bleeds, you can kill it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great one. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
because at that time they were like, "There's no way we're going to defeat this,"
yeah,
and then
yeah,
Arnold like drew blood, and it's like, "If it bleeds, you
yeah.
can kill it."
That's a great line. It's a great moment in that movie too.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's the turning point, right? That's when he
yeah,
finally could believe that it was possible. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, okay, I know you have talked this next topic to death, but I don't think that we really covered it last time. And it pertains to what we're talking about. Talk to me or explain to those listening about the self and the ego, like what exactly that concept is.
Oh, that's a, that's a big one.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll be here for a couple
this,
days.
yeah, this is just my own theory. I
Yeah.
don't base it on anything. Um, I think that the psyche is divided into at least two parts: the self and the ego. I'm getting this from Carl Jung and from Joseph Campbell and things like that. The self with a capital S is like the big circle, the big psyche, and within it is a little circle called the ego. And the ego is lives in the ego is really our material existence, our flesh and blood. The ego believes that death is real. The ego believes that you and I are separate from one another, that I could hurt you and not hurt myself. The ego believes that time and space are real, and and I'm forgetting what the last thing that I'm thinking of is, but the ego is fearful. Oh, its predominant emotion is fear because the ego is relating to our physical flesh and the fact that we can die, we can be hurt, et cetera, et cetera. The self is a much bigger thing. And the self is kind of like you might call it the soul or whatever the next higher dimension. And in the self, death is not real. Like the gods are immortal, right? In the self, you and I are not separate from each other. And if I hurt you, it's going to hurt me. Karma, right? There's no such thing as separation. And the self is also the predominant emotion of the self is not fear but love. And my whole long thing here is when we're trying to get to our creative center, what we're really trying to, or find our voice, we're trying to move from the ego to the self. And the ego, in terms of being a writer or a creative person, is the voice that says, "Oh, I got to have a hit. The next one's got to be a hit." And as soon as you publish it or you release an album, you're looking at the sales figures. So how are we doing? Are we making any money? Are people standing in line at the theater? It's that kind of thing, right? And but the self is beyond that. The self kind of knows that, like I was just saying, we have a body of work, and our job is to get it out there. Whether it finds an audience or not, we're not in charge of that. All we can do is do our work. So I do think that the odyssey that a creative person goes on from the start of their career is to get out of the ego and into the self. You know, and that self will always surprise you because it's tapped into deeper levels of the psyche.
And that transition is such a journey of it on its own, like,
Oh
because the
yeah.
beginning of an artist's journey is so filled with that fear-based, like, I'm not good enough, I won't be able to do it, it's too late, all these things. um and you're trying to get to a point where you're operating out of love and happiness and confidence, but it's so hard to get there when you haven't done the thing that you believe that you can do yet. So even just that first stage is so challenging.
Yeah, really. I mean, for me, realistically, I would say it took me like 30 years to get to that point of just kind of beating my head into the wall as an egomaniac, wanting to succeed, et cetera, worried about what was I really a writer? Was I really writing? And until finally you sort of reach the point where you just give up and you
Hmm.
say, let me just put down whatever puke I'm going to put on this page, and and it's just let it rip. And then finally that's kind of the corner that you hope to turn.
Yeah. I don't mean to bring this back to Mike Tyson, but he had a interview clip one time that he talked about when he was doing great, he was at his happiest. I
Yeah.
mean, he was happy going in there. He wasn't mad. I mean, he was demolishing people, right? But he wasn't going in there angry, trying to hurt people. He said he was the happiest he'd ever been. His Cuss was his father figure, and when he passed away, everything started going downhill. His confidence went downhill. All the bad things that happened in his kind of like demise. But he had mentioned that he was like, no, I was always happy. When I was doing
Mhm.
well, during that time in his life. So I thought that was interesting because it was a sport so brutal. One might think that
Yeah,
you got to
yeah,
be like angry to go in there and be good at
yeah.
it. He was like, no, and that's why if you watch him early on, he would hug and even sometimes kiss his opponents on the cheek, like he was very, and it was strange because he just like knocked him out in like 20 seconds, and then he'd hug him when he was like 17, 18, and kiss him. It's funny.
Huh.
So there, chapter 2, or the second day rather, this is the part that I wanted to bring up last time. Actually, sorry, I apologize. This was the intro. It says art is life, and the stuff of our stories parallel the stuff of our lives. And something I'm paraphrasing at this point, the challenges that our heroes went through are the same as ours. Can you talk to me more about that concept?
Okay. This is from the Daily Pressfield. It's
Yes.
like the introduction to it.
Yeah.
And it's just like, as I said before, I was hoping that this 365-day book, that you could view it on one level as helping you write a story from A to Z, or write a concept album or something, or a film from A to Z, with your characters. In other words, you're dealing with my characters need to go through this crisis at this point, and they need to resolve it at that point. But the point I was trying to make was, that's us too, as we're trying to write the story, right? Just as our hero, when he or she gets into Act Two and is in the middle of, the hell of that Act Two, of where they're gonna, they're just getting hammered by the villain, whatever. We too, as the writers of that story, or filmmakers, we're going to be in that exact same place. We'll be
Mm,
going, oh my God, how did I get into this thing? How am I going to get out of it? So that the reason why we write stories the way we do is because that's how life works. The reason why there is a turning point at a certain point, or there's an all is lost moment in a story, is because there's all is lost moments in our life. And that's, so the, the point I was just trying to make was that the struggles that we put our heroes through in our fiction or our albums or whatever are the same things we go through as the storytellers, trying to get these things out. Um, so and in fact, that's part of the structure of the book. There's things, there's a couple of weeks in there I talk about the hero's journey, and then I talk about the hero's journey in our real life. What are
yeah.
we doing living out his hero's journey? Or the all is lost moment in our fictional character's life, and then an all is lost moment in our real life. Um, so that's the point I was trying to make, Rain.
Absolutely. You had said something in Government Cheese about it's similar to the, art imitates life concept, but it was along the lines of like art is how we endure pain, or we kind of make this image of ourselves. And you mentioned a couple of examples of, like, could be someone, a bodybuilder, or someone with a lot of tattoos, or however they express themselves as a way of overcoming or working through some pain. And I really related to that because, I mean, listen, all the stories that I write and projects that I work on, I mean, yeah, I grew up with an alcoholic father. Like that's in a lot of them. I've had a lot of loss in my life. That's in a
Yeah.
lot of them, and I noticed that in myself. And it seems to be that that is a thing. Is it fair to say it's not just me, but that's what we tend to do as people?
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. Um, I forget where I wrote this somewhere. I had a mentor named Paul Rink, as you know, from Government Cheese and also from the Daily Pressfield. And I used to have breakfast with him every morning. He lived in a little camper down the street from me. This was like 40 years ago or something like that. And we would have a cup of coffee together every morning. And I remember we had another friend, an older guy, who had been in in the war, had been in prison, he'd been through hell. He was a writer, and and his writing career was going great. He was writing about the horrible shit that he'd been through. And I said to Paul, I said, how do you square that? That the guy's been through so much hell, but yet he's really doing great now. And Paul said, pain and suffering has never hurt any writer that I know of. And I thought that's so true. That's like the marrow that we all get our stuff from. But I also think, as a point, that we don't have to literally tell our literal story. If we've had
True.
addiction issues or whatever that, or whatever people write about. In fact, I would advise young writers, don't write about that. Don't write about that literal stuff, because it will come out in other ways. If you write Game of Thrones, it'll come out as something between Arya and the Hound, or something, and it'll come out in a much more magical and better way. And we'll realize, as we're writing some scene that took place, in a mystical world, we'll say, "Holy shit, this is about my mom and me when I was 4 years old." But nobody needs to know that. It it's the fertile ground that we tap into, but I don't think we necessarily have to tell that literal true story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's way more about. I mean, this is what stories are about. It's. I've said this before. It's not about experiencing the exact events, but feeling the same feelings, right? Or feeling the
Yeah.
emotions that are felt. So it doesn't have to be an alcoholic father from Eastern North Carolina. It's
Yeah.
about what it feels like to feel abandoned or whatever, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's the heart underneath the kind of surface of the story, I think. I have a question that just came in. I want to ask really quickly from Robert. It says, "Is it realistic to try to crush resistance entirely, or is it reasonable to get comfortable dancing with it?"
Dancing with it, I think, is the only way
Is
because
the
you're
only.
never going to defeat it. You can only defeat. It's sort of like what they tell you in AA. One day at a
Mm.
time, right? There's always you can only beat it one day at a time, and but that's good enough. If you can just sit down and work for that day, that's good enough.
Last question to that point. Great setup. Great unintentional setup. If I'm somebody who my day one is today, right? And I'm sick of talking about it. I'm sick of dreaming about it and thinking about it. And I'm going to write that screenplay or write that book or whatever it may be. And I got a copy of the Daily Pressfield back here. In this first step, and there's lots of advice, 365 days of it. But what's the first thing that you say to somebody like that who's like, this is finally it. This is day one. I'm walking into the building to defeat resistance and do the thing that I want to do.
I think it's a commitment over time
Mm.
because the it's very easy to say, like we just said, one day at a time.
Yeah.
And that is true. You can only do it one day at a time. But you've got to start thinking right away of, let's say it's a novel you're going to write. It's going to take 2 years, whatever that is, 700 and what it, I don't know what it is. Think in those terms right now, that one day at a time, you're going to hang in there for 750 days and come hell or high water, you're going to get to that last day. That's it. Otherwise, if you if if you haven't got that long-term commitment, resistance will defeat you along the way somewhere.
Mm.
Um, it's like if you were going to run the Ironman or swim, bike, run the Ironman, and it was 18 months from now, you were going to be in Kona, Hawaii doing it. You got to project yourself in your mind to that finish line and know that you've got to hang in over that long period. The training is a marathon, it's not a sprint, just like the writing or the composing or the filmmaking is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So you have to sort of steel yourself for the real hardcore effort, but at the same time, giving yourself enough of a break, realizing this is a long term thing. You're going to have to go easy on yourself, from time to time. And if you fall off the wagon, it's okay. You're going to get back on. But that it's a long term commitment. And in the real world, before what I said about imagining a body of work, a shelf full of books, it's a lifetime commitment. And the sooner you can make it, the better off it is. Better off you'll be.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Steve, man, thanks so much for coming back on. I personally appreciate your lifetime commitment to the game, and benefit from it every
Well,
half
you
year.
got
It
you got it
seems.
too, Rain. So, and thank you for the great questions and for having me back on. It's always a
Absolutely.
pleasure. I'm happy to
And
do it again.
and listen, I've said it before to you, and I'll say it again. If you and Diana make it to the new hip Durham anytime soon, you let me know. We'll get some
We'll do
coffee.
it. We'll do it. Okay.
All right, buddy. Have a great
All
day.
right.